I came home from the doctor 2 hours earlier than usual. I had to pick up some test results, but they closed early due to an emergency. Those were the voices of my two children, Carlos and Patricia. They were whispering, which was strange because they never get along. I froze when I clearly heard the words slow-acting poison, and without her noticing, my heart stopped. I had to hear more details. I took off my shoes to avoid making noise on the stairs. Patricia was saying, with the right dose, it will look like a natural heart attack. At her age, no one will suspect.
Heard the specific details. They would mix it into my nightly chamomile tea, which I've been drinking religiously.
Patricia mentioned that the house is worth $1.2 million, plus the savings, investments, and life insurance policy. I went down exactly the way I had come up, avoiding the steps that creak. I had to act like I had just arrived.
I yelled cheerfully, "I'm home. The doctor finished really quickly today." Immediately, the voices upstairs stopped. When they came down, I hugged them as always. Carlos asked about the medical tests. Patricia offered to make dinner. For 3 days, I watched every movement.
Serving my meals on specific plates, always the same ones. Carlos made sure I ate everything, which was unusual for him.
I found an unlabeled bottle hidden behind the canned goods in the pantry. Clear liquid with no smell. At that moment, I understood that the sweet, naive mother they thought I was had died.
I called my lawyer, Roberto, that same afternoon. I explained that I wanted to make some urgent changes to my will.
My name is Elena Martinez. I'm 75 years old, and for my entire life, I thought I knew my children. How wrong I was. It all began on a Tuesday in October that would change my life forever. It was one of those grey autumn days when dry leaves dance in the wind like omens of change. I had an appointment with Dr. Hernandez at 3 in the afternoon to pick up my annual test results. As always, I had arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality is a virtue my parents instilled in me from childhood. But when I arrived at the clinic, I encountered an unexpected surprise. The receptionist, a young woman named Maria, whom I already knew from my previous visits, greeted me with an apologetic expression. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry to inform you that Dr. Hernandez had to leave for an emergency. His father suffered a heart attack and is in the hospital," she explained while nervously organizing some papers. "But since your results are ready and they're routine, I can give them to you right now." I received the manila envelope with my test results, thanked Maria, and left the clinic with a strange feeling of emptiness. It wasn't just concern for the doctor and his father, but something deeper, as if the universe had altered its natural course. I looked at my watch. It was barely 2:15 in the afternoon. I would have almost 3 free hours before Carlos and Patricia expected me to arrive home. During the bus ride, I decided not to call them, to let them know I would arrive early. I wanted to give them a pleasant surprise. Maybe we could have tea together in the garden, like we used to do when they were little. Carlos, my eldest son at 45, had been very stressed lately with his job at the construction company. Patricia, 42, also seemed overwhelmed with her recent divorce and custody of her 2 children. As a mother, I had always worried about them. After my husband Roberto died 5 years ago, I felt it was my duty to take care of what remained of the family. That's why, when both of them asked to come live with me temporarily after their respective financial problems, I didn't hesitate to accept. The house was large, there was plenty of space, and they kept me company. The bus dropped me off at the corner of my house, a beautiful 2-story residence that Roberto and I had bought 30 years ago when our handicraft import business was prospering. It was a house full of memories, with well-maintained gardens and architecture that reflected our years of hard work and sacrifice. As I walked along the stone path to the front door, I noticed something strange. Carlos's car was in the driveway, and so was Patricia's. Normally, at this time, both of them were working. Carlos at the construction office and Patricia at her part-time job at an advertising agency. Had they missed work? Had something happened? I took out my keys carefully trying not to make noise. I wanted to surprise them, but I had also begun to feel an inexplicable uneasiness in my chest. When I opened the front door, the house was silent, but not the normal silence of an empty house. It was a tense silence, as if something important was happening. I left my purse on the entrance table and took off my shoes, as was my custom. It was then that I heard it, voices whispering upstairs. Voices I immediately recognized as Carlos and Patricia's, but speaking in a tone I had never heard before. It was a conspiratorial whisper, urgent, charged with a tension that chilled my blood. I stood motionless at the foot of the stairs, my heart beginning to beat harder. Carlos and Patricia rarely spoke to each other without arguing. Since childhood they had been like water and oil. He, methodical and calculating. She, impulsive and emotional. The fact that they were talking in secret, in whispers, was so unusual that I immediately knew something wasn't right. It has to be soon. I heard Patricia's voice, filtered through the ceiling. We can't wait any longer. I know, Carlos responded with his characteristic deep voice, but lower than normal. But it has to seem natural. We can't make mistakes. I felt as if a cold hand grabbed my stomach. What were they talking about? What had to seem natural? I moved closer to the stairs, holding my breath to hear better. The words that followed destroyed my world in a split second. The slow-acting poison is perfect. Carlos continued. I researched it for weeks. It's undetectable. No taste, no smell. At her age, when she dies, everyone will think it was a natural heart attack. The world stopped. I literally felt as if the floor moved beneath my feet. Poison? Were they talking about poisoning someone? My mind refused to process what my ears had clearly heard. Are you sure it will work? Asked Patricia. And in her voice I detected a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Completely sure. The compound I got is used in, well, let's say in certain, very specific circles. A small daily dose for 2 weeks, mixed in her nightly tea, and her heart will simply stop. It will look like she died in her sleep. Her nightly tea? I repeated mentally. My mind began connecting pieces I didn't want to unite. I drank chamomile tea every night before bed. It was a habit I had developed after Roberto's death, to calm my nerves and help me fall asleep. Carlos and Patricia knew it. Everyone in the family knew it. No, it couldn't be. They weren't talking about me. They couldn't be talking about me. But then I heard the words that confirmed my worst nightmare. Mom will never suspect anything, Patricia said, with a coldness I had never heard in her voice. She always drinks her tea exactly at 9 at night. She's so predictable in her routines that it will be easy. The air left my lungs, as if someone had punched me in the chest. My own children, the flesh of my flesh, were planning to murder me. The woman who had carried them in her womb, who had spent sleepless nights when they had fever, who had worked to exhaustion to give them the best possible education, who had sacrificed her own dreams to secure their future. I had to grab the handrail to keep from falling. My legs were shaking uncontrollably, and I felt like I was going to vomit. But the conversation continued, and each word was like a dagger stabbing deeper into my heart. Once she's dead, we'll inherit everything. Carlos continued with terrifying practicality. The house is worth at least $1.2 million in the current market. The savings, investments, life insurance policy, I've calculated it will be approximately $2.8 million for each of us. $2.8 million, Patricia repeated, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Finally, we'll be able to live as we deserve. I'll be able to buy that house in the exclusive neighborhood for me and the kids, and you'll be able to expand your business. They were talking about my death, as if it were a commercial transaction. As if my life was worth only the sum of my material possessions. As if the 75 years I had lived, the love I had given them, the tears I had shed for them, meant absolutely nothing. But there was something more. Something in the casual way they discussed the details told me this wasn't an improvised conversation. They had been planning this for a while. How long? Weeks? Months? Since when had my own children decided I would be better off dead? "When do we start?" asked Patricia. "Tonight," Carlos responded without hesitation. "I already have everything ready. Patricia, you take care of preparing her tea as always. I'll make sure she drinks the entire cup. In 2 weeks, 3 at most, everything will be over. Tonight." They were going to start poisoning me that very night. Reality hit me like a tsunami. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. It wasn't a misunderstanding I could clear up with a conversation. My children, the human beings I loved most in the world, had decided to kill me for money. I needed to get out of there before they discovered me. With trembling legs, I headed toward the front door, desperately trying not to make noise. Each step seemed to resonate like thunder in my ears, although I knew objectively I was being silent. Once outside the house, I closed the door with the same care with which I had opened it. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the keys. I walked to the corner, away from the windows from where they could see me, and sat on a bench in the park, across from my house. My mind was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions: pain, betrayal, fear, disbelief, and above all, a deep sadness that seemed to emanate from the deepest part of my soul. How had I reached this point? At what moment had I failed as a mother for my children to consider my death a solution to their problems? At this moment of maximum emotional tension, while Elena finds herself alone on the bench, processing the most brutal betrayal of her life, I need to pause the story. I need you, dear viewers, to help me process this devastating situation. What would you do in Elena's place? How would you face discovering that your own children plan to kill you? Leave your comments below, because I really need to know your opinions. And if this story is impacting you as much as it's impacting me, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to find out what decision Elena will make, because what comes next will surprise you completely. Sitting on that bench, observing the house where I had been happy for so many years, I began to remember signs I might have ignored. In recent weeks, both Carlos and Patricia had been strangely interested in my daily routine. Patricia had begun insisting on preparing my nightly tea herself, something that had seemed like a sweet gesture from a concerned daughter. Carlos had been asking me about my medications, my medical appointments, even about my will. "I just want to make sure you're well taken care of, Mom," he had told me just last week while I was organizing my important papers. "Do you have all your legal paperwork in order?" At that moment I had thought it was wonderful to have such responsible children who were concerned about my well-being. Now I understood they were taking inventory of what would soon be theirs. I also remembered other things: the phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, the looks they exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching, the times I had found them whispering, and they had immediately changed the subject when I approached, and the small changes in their behavior toward me, a subtle coldness I had attributed to the stress of their respective life situations, an impatience when I told them stories from when they were little, a way of looking at me as if I were a burden, an obstacle between them and something they desired. That something was my death. While I remained sitting on the bench, I saw Carlos leave the house, get in his car, and drive away. He was probably going to get the poison, if he didn't already have it. Patricia stayed inside, surely preparing to receive the mother she planned to murder that very night. I looked at my watch. 4:30 in the afternoon. In my normal routine, I would arrive home around 6. That gave me an hour and a half to decide what to do. Should I call the police? Did I have enough evidence? Would they believe me if I told them I had heard my children planning my murder? But more importantly, did I really want to send my own children to jail? Despite what they had planned to do, they were still my children. I had loved them since before they were born. I had dedicated my entire life to raising and protecting them. The idea of destroying their lives, even though they wanted to destroy mine, was unbearable to me. I needed time to think, to process, to decide what my next step would be. But I also needed to stay alive. If I went home that night and drank the tea Patricia would prepare for me, I would be signing my own death warrant. I made a temporary decision. I would return home at my normal time, act as if nothing had happened, but I wouldn't drink the tea. I would invent some excuse. Maybe I would say I felt upset stomach, or that I had drunk too much coffee during the day and didn't need anything more to sleep. At least that would give me time to plan my next move. I got up from the bench with still trembling legs and began walking through the neighborhood. I needed to move my body, occupy my mind with something different from the horror of what I had discovered. I walked through streets I had known for decades, seeing houses where neighbors lived whom I had watched raise their children, marry, have their own children. Had any of them gone through something similar? Was it possible that other mothers had discovered such deep betrayals by their own children? Or was I the only woman in the world foolish enough to raise children capable of planning her murder? During my walk, my mind began to work more rationally. The initial shock was giving way to something colder, more calculated. If my children wanted to play a game of life and death, I would have to make sure I was smarter than them. Roberto had always told me I was stronger than I appeared. "Elena," he would say, "you have an inner strength that many men would envy. You just hide it behind your gentleness." Maybe it was time to find that strength. I returned home exactly at 6 o'clock, as was my custom. Patricia greeted me at the door with a smile that now seemed sinister to me. "Mom, how did it go with the doctor?" she asked while helping me with my coat. Her performance was perfect, the concerned and loving daughter. "Very well, dear," I replied, surprising myself with how normal my voice sounded. Everything came out perfect in the tests. The doctor says I have the health of a 50-year-old woman. I saw her smile slightly tighten. Had it been my imagination, or had I really detected a flash of disappointment in her eyes? "How wonderful," she said, but her enthusiasm sounded forced. "Carlos will arrive soon. I thought about making your favorite dinner to celebrate the good results." My favorite dinner. How considerate. They surely wanted my last meal to be special. "That's very sweet of you, Patricia," I told her, and I really tried to sound genuinely grateful. "Do you need help in the kitchen?" "No, Mom. You rest. I'll prepare everything for you, including your nightly tea." There it was. The casual mention of the tea that would contain my first dose of poison. "How considerate you are," I managed to say without my voice breaking. During dinner, which proceeded with superficial normalcy, I observed my children with new eyes. Carlos arrived punctually at 7, as always, and his behavior was impeccable. He asked about my medical tests, commented on the weather, talked about his work. Patricia was equally normal, telling me about the children and their school activities. If I hadn't heard their conversation that afternoon, I would have thought it was a perfectly normal family dinner. But now I could see the performances behind their masks. The way Carlos looked at me when he thought I wasn't aware, as if he were evaluating my physical state. How Patricia made sure I finished all the food, insisting on serving me generous portions. "You need to maintain your strength, Mom," she would tell me with a smile while filling my plate a second time. Yes, I thought bitterly. They needed me to be strong enough so that my death would seem sudden and unexpected, not the result of a prolonged illness. After dinner, as was tradition, we sat in the living room to talk a bit before each of us retired to our rooms. This was normally my favorite time of the day. Quality time with my children, without the distractions of work or external responsibilities. Tonight, every minute felt like torture. Finally, around 8:45, Patricia got up from the sofa. "I'm going to prepare your tea, Mom," she announced with a sweet smile. This was the moment. In a few minutes, she would return with a cup of chamomile tea containing the first dose of poison that would eventually kill me. My first real test would be to refuse that cup without arousing suspicion. While Patricia was in the kitchen, Carlos and I continued talking about trivial topics. But I could feel his tension, the way his eyes constantly went toward the kitchen, waiting for his sister's return with the instrument of my death. Patricia returned with a tray containing my favorite cup, the blue porcelain one with hand-painted flowers that Roberto had given me on our 10th anniversary. How appropriate that they had chosen that cup for their macabre purpose. "Your tea, Mom," Patricia said, placing the tray on the table next to my chair. "I made it exactly as you like it, with a teaspoon of honey." The familiar aroma of chamomile tea filled my nostrils. It was a smell I had associated for years with relaxation, with comfort, with the peaceful end of each day. Now it made me nauseous. "Thank you, dear," I said, taking the cup in my hands. It was hot, and for an absurd moment, I thought about how careful Patricia had been to prepare it at the perfect temperature. Even when planning to kill me, she made sure the tea was just as I liked it. I brought the cup toward my lips, but at the last moment, I feigned a small coughing spasm. "Oh, excuse me," I said, moving the cup away from my mouth. It seems something got stuck in my throat. I saw Carlos and Patricia exchange a quick look. There was tension in their faces. "Are you okay, Mom?" asked Carlos, but there was something in his tone that sounded more anxious than concerned. Yes, I replied, coughing a bit more to give credibility to my performance. "I just need a little water." I got up to go to the kitchen, taking the cup of tea with me. Once there, I discreetly emptied the contents into the sink and filled the cup with hot water, adding a little honey to maintain the basic color and aroma. When I returned to the living room, both were watching me expectantly. "Better now," I said, lifting the cup and drinking the honey water. "How strange, the tea tastes a little different tonight." The expression of alarm on Patricia's face was instantaneous. "Different? In what way?" she asked, trying to sound casual but failing completely. "I don't know," I said, pretending to reflect while taking another sip of water. "Maybe it's my imagination. Or maybe I changed honey brands." Carlos visibly relaxed when I finished the entire cup. "That's probably it," he said. "Sometimes different brands can change the taste." That night, after saying goodbye to my children with kisses on the cheek, how could I continue kissing the people who wanted to kill me? I retired to my room, but not to sleep. I had a lot to think about and plan. I sat on my bed, looking at the family photos that decorated my nightstand. Photos of Carlos and Patricia when they were children, graduations, birthdays, family vacations. In each image, my children smiled with what I had believed was genuine love. When had that love begun to change to greed? Had there been signs I had overlooked? I remembered the years after Roberto's death, when both had insisted on coming to live with me. At that moment, I had thought it was because they loved me and didn't want me to be alone. Now I wondered if it had been a strategic decision, a first step in a long-term plan to more easily access my fortune. Because I had to admit that Roberto and I had been financially fortunate. Our import business had prospered for decades. We had made intelligent investments, and there was a considerable life insurance policy. Added to the value of the house and our savings, it effectively represented several $1,000,000. Money that Carlos and Patricia would automatically inherit when I died, being my only children and heirs. But what hurt me most wasn't the financial betrayal, it was the emotional betrayal. For months, maybe years, my children had been acting as if they loved me while secretly planning my death. Every hug had been a lie. Every "I love you, Mom" had been a performance. Every moment of supposed concern for my well-being had been an evaluation of how easy it would be to kill me. How was I going to continue living in the same house as the people who wanted to see me dead? How was I going to sit at the table with them every night, knowing what I knew? How was I going to pretend normalcy when my entire world had collapsed in a single afternoon? But while I was sitting there, surrounded by memories of a family that had turned out to be an illusion, something began to change inside me. The sadness and pain were giving way to something stronger, more determined. My children had gravely underestimated their mother. Elena Martinez hadn't reached 75 by being naive or weak. She had built a successful business from scratch alongside her husband. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the business world for decades. She had faced the loss of the love of her life and had found a way to move forward. If Carlos and Patricia wanted to play a dangerous game, they would discover that their mother knew how to play too. And she had much more experience than they did. The sweet old lady they thought they could easily manipulate, and poison was about to show them exactly what she was made of. Because, if there was something Roberto had taught me during our 45 years of marriage, it was that when someone betrays you, you don't stand there waiting for the next blow. You make sure to strike the first blow yourself. That night, for the first time in months, I smiled for real. Because I had just realized something that Carlos and Patricia didn't know. I could also be very good at acting. And I had the advantage of knowing exactly what they were planning, while they had no idea that I knew. The game was about to begin. And this time, Mom wasn't going to be the victim. The next morning, I woke up early. Around 5 in the morning. I hadn't slept well. How could I have after discovering that my own children planned to murder me? But my mind was clearer than ever. During the sleepless hours, I had been formulating a plan. First, I needed to confirm my suspicions. As terrible as it sounded, part of me still hoped I had misinterpreted the conversation from the day before. Maybe they had been talking about a movie, or a book, or some plan for a shady business that had nothing to do with me. My mother's heart desperately clung to any alternative explanation, but my rational mind knew the truth. The way they had specifically mentioned my habits, my nightly tea routine, my age, the inheritance. Everything had been too specific, too personal to be anything else. I dressed silently and went down to the kitchen. Carlos and Patricia were still sleeping. They never got up before 7. I had at least 2 hours to investigate. I began with the kitchen, the place where Patricia had prepared my tea the night before. I searched every cabinet, every drawer, every corner, where something suspicious could have been hidden. I didn't find anything obvious, but that didn't surprise me. If they were going to use poison, they probably had it very well hidden. Then I silently went up to Carlos's room. His door was closed, and I could hear his soft snoring from the hallway. I turned the knob with extreme care, grateful that Roberto had oiled all the hinges in the house just a few months before he died. Carlos's room was tidy, as always. He was a meticulous man, something he had inherited from his father. I checked his desk, his dresser, his closet. In the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden under a pile of work papers, I found something that chilled my blood. It was a small bottle, the size of a vitamin bottle, but without a label. It contained a clear liquid, completely odorless when I carefully uncapped it. There was also a small syringe, wrapped in pharmacy paper. My heart began to beat so hard, I feared Carlos might hear it from his bed. This was the poison, there was no doubt about it. But I needed more evidence. With trembling hands, I took a photo of the bottle with my cell phone, making sure it was clearly visible. Then, I put it back exactly in the same position where I had found it. I also searched Patricia's room, but didn't find anything incriminating. Apparently, Carlos was in charge of the physical part of the plan, while Patricia would be responsible for administration. I returned to my room just as I heard Carlos getting up to go to the bathroom. It had been close, but I had obtained the confirmation I needed. The poison was real. The plan was real. The threat to my life was completely real. During breakfast, I observed my children with a new perspective. Now that I knew what I knew, I could see the signs I had been overlooking. The way Carlos evaluated my physical appearance every morning, as if he were calculating how long it would take me to die. How Patricia insisted on serving me coffee and making sure I ate all my food. "How did you sleep last night, Mom?" asked Patricia while serving me scrambled eggs. "I hope the tea helped you relax." "Very well, dear," I lied gently. "I slept like a baby. Your tea was perfect." I saw them exchange a quick look. They were satisfied that their plan had begun successfully. Carlos got up to serve himself more coffee. "Mom, have you thought lately about updating your will?" "I'm just asking, because at your age it's important to have everything in order." How subtle. They weren't even waiting for the poison to take effect before starting to talk about my death. "I haven't thought much about that," I replied, although I had actually updated my will just 6 months before. "Why do you ask?" "Well," said Carlos, sitting down again, "Patricia and I have been talking, and we want to make sure you have all your legal documentation in order. Just in case." "Just in case," I repeated. How considerate. Worrying about my imminent death. "Maybe we could make an appointment with your lawyer next week," suggested Patricia, "just to review that everything is updated." They wanted me to have my will perfectly in order before they killed me. How efficient. "That's an excellent idea," I said, smiling sweetly. "I'll call Mr. Rodriguez today." What I didn't tell them was that I was indeed going to call my lawyer, but not to update my will. I had other plans in mind. After breakfast, Carlos left for work, and Patricia went out to do some shopping. Finally, I had the house to myself. It was time to put my plan into action. First, I called Dr. Hernandez. His secretary informed me that he had returned to work and that his father was stable. I asked for an urgent appointment for that same afternoon. "Is it an emergency, Mrs. Martinez?" the secretary asked me. "Let's say I need a second opinion about something very important," I replied. Then I called Mr. Rodriguez, my trusted lawyer for the last 20 years. "Elena, what a pleasure to hear from you," he greeted me with his warm and familiar voice. "How can I help you?" "I need to see you urgently, Fernando. It's a very delicate matter, and I prefer not to discuss it over the phone." "Of course. How about this afternoon at 4? "Perfect." My next call was the most difficult. I dialed the number of my niece Carmen, my late sister's daughter. Carmen lived in another city, but we had maintained a close relationship over the years. She was an intelligent woman, a lawyer like Mr. Rodriguez, and one of the few people I trusted completely. "Aunt Elena, what a pleasant surprise," Carmen greeted me when she answered. "How are you?" "Carmen, dear, I need to ask you a very big favor. But before I explain, I need you to promise me that this will stay between us, no matter what you think of what I'm about to tell you." There was a pause. Carmen was intelligent enough to detect the seriousness in my voice. "Of course, Aunt. You know you can trust me. What's happening?" I told her everything, from beginning to end, I heard her sharp intake of breath when I got to the part about the poison, and her exclamations of disbelief when I described the bottle I had found in Carlos's room. "My God, Aunt Elena," she whispered when I finished my story. This is attempted murder. You have to call the police immediately." "I can't, Carmen," I explained. "Not yet. I only have circumstantial evidence. A conversation I heard, and an unlabeled bottle. Any competent lawyer could argue that I misinterpreted the conversation and that the bottle contains anything innocent. But, Aunt, listen to me, please. I need you to come here. I need witnesses to what's happening. And I need help to document everything properly. But more than anything, I need the support of someone from the family who really loves me." Carmen didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll leave tomorrow morning. I'll arrive before noon. Thank you, dear. And Carmen, be very careful. If Carlos and Patricia discover that you know something, you could be in danger too." After hanging up, I sat in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what I was facing. It wasn't just that my children wanted to kill me. It was that I was going to have to fight for my life against the two people I had loved most in the world. But I wasn't defenseless. I had resources. I had intelligence. And now I had a plan. Roberto had always told me that when someone underestimates you, that becomes your greatest advantage. Carlos and Patricia saw me as a naive and vulnerable old woman. It was time to show them how wrong they were. I spent the rest of the morning preparing meticulously. I wrote a detailed account of everything I had seen and heard, including dates, times, and exact words when I could remember them. I took more photos of the poison bottle, this time from different angles and with better lighting. I also began documenting Carlos and Patricia's recent behavior. I wrote about all the times they had asked about my health, my finances, my will, all the occasions when I had found them whispering, and they had changed the subject when I approached, all the small changes in their way of treating me that now took on a sinister meaning. When Patricia returned from her shopping around noon, I was in the living room reading quietly, as if it were a completely normal day. "How did you spend the morning, Mom?" she asked while putting away the bags in the kitchen. "Very quietly, dear. I read a little. Made some phone calls." "Phone calls?" "Yes. I called Dr. Hernandez to thank him for the excellent results of my tests. And Mr. Rodriguez to schedule that will review that Carlos mentioned." I saw her eyes light up. "How wonderful! When is the appointment?" "This afternoon at 4. Would you like me to accompany you? You know, to make sure you don't forget anything important." Of course she wanted to accompany me. She wanted to make sure I didn't change the will in a way that wouldn't suit them. "You're very considerate, Patricia. But I think I prefer to go alone. They're very personal matters, you know." I saw a shadow of frustration cross her face, but she managed to maintain her smile. "Of course, Mom. I just wanted to help." Lunch proceeded with superficial normalcy, but I could feel Patricia's tension. She was anxious to know what I was going to do with my will, but couldn't ask directly without seeming too interested. At 3:30, I prepared to leave. Patricia insisted that I take an extra sweater because it was cold, and gave me a kiss on the cheek when saying goodbye. "Be careful, Mom," she told me, "and don't make any important changes without consulting us first, okay?" "Of course not, dear," I lied gently. Mr. Rodriguez's office was downtown, in an elegant office building I had known for decades. Fernando Rodriguez was a 60-year-old man, with gray hair and kind eyes behind rimless glasses. He had handled all of Roberto's and my legal affairs for the last 20 years. "Elena," he greeted me with a warm smile when I entered his office. "You look very good." "As always." "Thank you, Fernando, but I'm afraid this isn't a social visit." His expression became serious immediately. Please sit down. Tell me what's happening. I related the entire story, just as I had done with Carmen. Fernando listened without interrupting, but I saw how his expression became more grave with each detail. Elena, he said finally, this is extremely serious. We're talking about premeditated attempted murder. I know, but I also know that the evidence I have wouldn't be sufficient for a conviction. I need more time to document everything properly. I understand your position, but your safety is most important. Have you considered simply leaving the house? You could stay at a hotel, or with some relative. I've thought about that, I admitted. But running away doesn't solve the fundamental problem. Carlos and Patricia would still be my children, would still have access to me eventually, and would still want my money. I need a more permanent solution. Fernando leaned forward. What do you have in mind? I want to change my will, immediately. In what way? I breathed deeply. This was the most difficult part of my plan, because it required that I hurt my children before they could hurt me. I want to establish a clause that specifies that if I die suspiciously, suddenly, or under circumstances that suggest poisoning, all my inheritance will go to charitable foundations. Carlos and Patricia will not receive a single cent. Fernando whistled softly. That's very specific. And I also want to include a sealed letter, explaining exactly what I've discovered, to be opened only in case of my death. Elena, you'd essentially be taking away their motive to kill you. Exactly. Fernando reflected for a moment. It's brilliant, actually. But what if they simply decide to kill you out of revenge, or to prevent you from exposing them? That's where the second part of my plan comes in. But I need this to be legally established first. We spent the next 2 hours elaborating the necessary documents. Fernando brought 2 of his partners as witnesses, without explaining the details of why I was making these changes. The new will was a complex document that included multiple protection clauses. In addition to the clause about suspicious death, I also established that if any member of my family was arrested or accused of any crime against me, they would automatically lose any right to inheritance. I also created a trust fund that would provide Carlos and Patricia with a modest monthly amount if I died of natural causes after age 80. But that would be completely cancelled if I died before. This incentivizes them to keep you alive and healthy, Fernando observed while we reviewed the final document. That's the idea. I also wrote a detailed letter explaining everything I had discovered, including the location of the poison bottle in Carlos's room. This letter would be sealed and only opened if I died under suspicious circumstances. When we finished, it was almost 6 in the evening. The documents were signed, sealed, and legally registered. Fernando would keep copies in his safe, and another copy would be sent to a bank in another city. Elena, Fernando told me as he accompanied me to the door, I still think you should consider involving the police. I will if necessary, I promised him. But first I want to try to resolve this another way. The trip back home was tense. I knew that both Carlos and Patricia would be anxious to know what I had done in the lawyer's office. I had to be prepared for their questions without revealing my true intentions. When I arrived home, both were waiting for me in the living room. The anxiety on their faces was barely disguised. How did it go, Mom? Carlos asked immediately. Very well, I replied, hanging my coat in the closet. Mr. Rodriguez is as efficient as always. Did you make any important changes? Asked Patricia, trying to sound casual. Just some minor updates, I lied. I changed the designation of some personal items, updated some addresses, that kind of thing. I saw the relief on their faces. They thought I hadn't done anything that would affect their plans. And the main inheritance? Asked Carlos. Does it remain the same? Of course, I said with a smile. You are my only children. Who else would I leave everything to? That night, during dinner, I carefully observed my children's behavior. They were more relaxed than the previous night, evidently relieved that I hadn't made significant changes to my will. Carlos even joked about some of his work projects, and Patricia told me funny stories about her children. It was a perfect performance of a loving and normal family. If I didn't know the truth, I would have been completely deceived. When Patricia got up to prepare my nightly tea, my heart began to race again. This would be the second dose of poison, if my plan didn't work. But tonight, I had a different strategy. When Patricia returned with the tea, I accepted it gratefully and placed it on the table next to my chair, as always. Thank you, dear. It smells delicious. But instead of drinking it immediately, I continued talking with Carlos about a television program we were watching. After about 15 minutes, I yawned theatrically. "Oh, I'm more tired than I thought," I said. "I think I'm going to go to bed now." "But you haven't drunk your tea," Patricia observed, with barely disguised concern. "You're right," I said, lifting the cup. But instead of drinking it, I feigned another coughing attack, this time more dramatic than the previous one. "Sorry," I said between coughs. "It seems something is irritating my throat tonight." "Do you want me to bring you a glass of water?" Carlos offered. "No, don't worry. I think I'll just skip the tea tonight. My throat is very sensitive." I saw the frustration and alarm on their faces. 2 consecutive nights without drinking the tea meant 2 nights without poison. If this continued, their plan would be delayed indefinitely. "Are you sure, Mom?" Patricia insisted. "The tea might help with your irritated throat." "No, dear. When my throat is like this, any hot liquid makes it worse. I'd better go to sleep." I said goodbye to both with kisses on the cheek and went up to my room, taking the full cup with me. Once in my room, I emptied the contents into the bathroom sink and rinsed the cup carefully. From my window, which faced the backyard, I could see the light on in the kitchen. Carlos and Patricia were having another urgent conversation. Although I couldn't hear the words, their body language told me they were frustrated and worried. My plan was working. By changing my will, I had eliminated their financial motive to kill me. But they still didn't know it. Meanwhile, by avoiding drinking the tea, I was keeping myself alive while deciding what my next move would be. But I knew I couldn't continue avoiding the tea indefinitely without arousing serious suspicion. I needed a more permanent solution, and I needed it soon. Carmen would arrive the next day. That would give me the support and witnesses I needed for the next phase of my plan. Because, although I had temporarily neutralized the threat, I still had to deal with the fundamental fact that my own children had tried to murder me. And that required a response that was as definitive as their betrayal had been devastating. I stayed awake most of that night, finalizing the details of what I had to do. It was a risky plan, but it was the only way to protect myself long-term and ensure that Carlos and Patricia could never hurt anyone else. At dawn, I was ready for the final confrontation. Carmen arrived as she had promised. Shortly before noon the next day. She was an elegant woman of 40, with the same determination that had characterized our family. When I hugged her at the door, I felt for the first time in days that I wasn't completely alone. "Aunt Elena," she whispered in my ear, "are you okay? You look very pale." "I'm fine, dear. Just tired. These have been very difficult days." Carlos and Patricia received Carmen with surprise, but tried to hide their discomfort. They hadn't expected visits, especially not from a family member who could interfere with their plans. "Carmen, what a pleasant surprise," said Patricia, although her smile seemed forced. "What brings you here?" "I had some free days at work and wanted to visit Aunt Elena," Carmen replied naturally. "It's been too long since we last saw each other." During lunch, Carmen was the perfect observer. Without seeming obvious, she noticed every detail of Carlos and Patricia's behavior. The way they insisted on serving my food. How Patricia made sure I finished everything on my plate. The looks they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. After lunch, Carmen and I retired to my room, under the pretext of catching up on family news. "My God, Aunt," Carmen whispered once I closed the door. "You're right. Their behavior is definitely suspicious. The way they watch you is disturbing." "Carmen, I need you to do something for me tonight," I said. "When Patricia prepares my tea, I need you to take a sample without them noticing. We can analyze it in a laboratory to confirm it contains poison." "Of course. But Aunt, have you thought about what you'll do after? Once you have definitive proof, what's your plan?" That was the question I had been avoiding, because the answer was the most painful of all. "I'll have to send them to jail, Carmen. There's no other option." That afternoon, while Carlos was at work, I decided to directly confront Patricia. I couldn't continue living this lie. I needed answers, even if they were painful. I found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She worked with efficient movements, as always, but there was a tension in her shoulders I hadn't noticed before. "Patricia," I said, closing the kitchen door behind me. "We need to talk." She turned, surprised by the serious tone of my voice. "About what, Mom?" "About the poison Carlos has hidden in his room." The transformation in Patricia's face was instantaneous and terrifying. Her mask of loving daughter completely collapsed, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice had lost all warmth. "I heard your conversation 2 days ago. I know exactly what you're planning to do." Patricia looked at me for a long moment, as if evaluating her options. Then, to my complete surprise, she sat in one of the kitchen chairs and covered her face with her hands. "How long have you known?" she asked with a muffled voice. "Since Tuesday. I arrived early from the medical appointment and heard you talking." Patricia raised her head, and for the first time, I saw something that resembled remorse in her eyes. "Mom, you have to understand. It's not just about the money." "Then why, Patricia? Why would you want to kill your own mother?" What Patricia told me next changed everything I believed I knew about the situation. "Because you're sick, Mom, very sick, and you don't know it." The world stopped around me. "What?" 3 months ago, Carlos and I went to talk to Dr. Hernandez. "We were worried because you had started forgetting things, repeating stories, getting confused about dates and names. We asked him to do specialized tests without you knowing." My mind refused to process what I was hearing. "The results came last week," Patricia continued with tears in her eyes. "You have advanced Alzheimer's, Mom. The doctor says you have maybe 6 months before you start losing yourself completely. And after that, it will be years of slow and painful deterioration." "No," I whispered. "That's not true. My tests this week came out perfect." "Those were routine tests, Mom. Basic blood work. The specialist's results are in Carlos's desk." I felt as if the floor had opened beneath me. But I heard you talking about inheritance. About money." "Yes," Patricia admitted. "Because we know that when you deteriorate completely, all your savings will go to specialized medical care. Dr. Hernandez explained to us that advanced Alzheimer's care can cost up to $10,000 a month. In 2 years, your entire fortune would have disappeared." "So, the poison?" Patricia breathed deeply. "It's not poison, Mom. It's a very strong sedative that Carlos got through a medical contact. We had planned to give you an overdose that would make you sleep peacefully. Without pain, without suffering, without years of not remembering who we are." The kitchen was spinning around me. Everything I had believed, everything I had planned, had been based on a completely wrong understanding of the situation. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me the chance to decide?" Because we know you, Mom, said Patricia, sobbing now. We know you would have fought the disease to the end, no matter how much you suffered. You would have spent every penny trying to find a cure that doesn't exist. And in the end, you would have died without recognizing us, without remembering anything of the beautiful life you built with Dad. Carlos appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, evidently having arrived from work early. Patricia, what's happening here? I told her everything, Patricia replied without looking up. I couldn't keep lying anymore. Carlos approached slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. Mom, he said softly, I know this is terrible to hear. I know what we were planning to do is wrong. But we love you too much to see you become a shadow of yourself. The medical results, I managed to whisper. I want to see the medical results. Carlos went up to his room and returned with a folder full of medical documents. I reviewed them with trembling hands, although the technical words blurred before my tear-filled eyes. But it was there, in black and white. Early-stage Alzheimer's, with accelerated progression. Prognosis: 6 to 8 months, before severe cognitive deterioration. Total life expectancy: 2 to 4 years. Why didn't Dr. Hernandez tell me anything when I went to pick up my tests? I asked. Because those weren't the important tests, Carlos explained. We specifically asked him not to tell you anything until we could find the right way to do it. I sat in silence for long minutes, processing this new reality. My children hadn't been trying to kill me out of greed. They had been trying to save me from a fate they considered worse than death. But that didn't make their plan right. What if I had wanted to fight? I asked finally. What if I had wanted to spend those last lucid months doing the things I love, saying goodbye properly, creating final memories with you? Carlos and Patricia exchanged guilty looks. We hadn't thought about that, Carlos admitted. You took away my choice, I continued, my voice becoming stronger. You took away my dignity to face my own death on my own terms. Mom, said Patricia, we just wanted to spare you the suffering. But suffering is part of life, Patricia. And the way someone faces suffering is what defines who they really are. Carmen, who had been listening from the hallway, entered the kitchen at that moment. Aunt Elena, she said softly. I heard everything. What do you want to do now? I looked at my 2 children, who watched me with a mixture of fear, guilt, and genuine love. Then I looked at Carmen, whose support had been my anchor during these terrible days. I want to live, I said finally. I want to live every day I have left, knowing exactly what's happening. I want to make peace with my illness, arrange my affairs, and spend quality time with the people I love. And us? Asked Carlos. Are you going to turn us in to the police? I thought about that question for a long moment. What they had planned to do was technically attempted murder, regardless of their motivations. But they were also my children. Children who had acted from a place of distorted love, but love nonetheless. No, I said finally. But there are conditions. What conditions? First, never again will you make decisions about my life without consulting me. No matter how sick I am, as long as I have mental capacity, the decisions about my medical care and my future are mine. Agreed, they both said immediately. Second, you're going to help me live these next months in the best way possible. We're going to take trips, we're going to create memories, we're going to have real conversations about what's happening. Of course, Mom. And third, I continued, my voice becoming firmer, when the time comes that I can no longer make decisions for myself, you will respect the decisions I make now about my future care. If I decide I want to fight to the end, you'll respect that. If I decide I want assisted dying when my quality of life deteriorates too much, you'll also respect that. Carlos and Patricia nodded, tears running down their faces. "We love you, Mom," Patricia whispered. "We're so sorry for making this decision without you." "I love you too," I replied, and it was true. Despite everything that had happened, they were still my children. But we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my garden, writing these final lines. My memory is no longer what it was, and some days are harder than others. But I've had 6 beautiful months with my children. 6 months of honesty, real conversations, genuine love. Carmen moved temporarily to help with my care. Carlos and Patricia have been patient and loving, respecting my decisions even when they don't agree with them. I've decided that when my illness progresses to the point where I no longer recognize myself, I want assisted dying in a country where it's legal. My children have agreed to accompany me on that final journey. I don't know how much time I have left being myself. Maybe weeks, maybe months. But I know that what remains of my life will be lived on my own terms, surrounded by real love, not the distorted love that almost cost me my life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't arrived home early that October day. If I had drunk the poison tea without ever knowing the truth about my illness or about my children's intentions. Maybe it would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been more right. Because in the end, dignity doesn't come from avoiding suffering. It comes from facing it with open eyes, surrounded by the people we love, making our own decisions until the last possible moment. And that's a lesson I hope my children carry with them, long after I'm no longer here to remind them. Elena Martinez. Spring, 2024. Final note. Elena died peacefully, 8 months after writing these words, at a clinic in Switzerland, surrounded by Carlos, Patricia, and Carmen. Her last words were, "Thank you for letting me choose."